this webinar will discuss the threatened rivers and the global approach within the framework of the Globe project. This is a webinar that fits within the Water Week organized by the H2O Lyon. There will be other webinars taking place, including one tomorrow from 5 p.m. to 6 p.m. for a dialogue in shared water. Another one will take place on Friday morning called Feeding the Water from the Lab to the Land to the Let's Share Our Knowledge. And this will take place on Thursday. There will be an evening party. Thank you, Sarah. Let me share my screen now. I hope you can see me. So let me introduce the seminar. I'll come back to the objectives. We are looking at, today we're looking at the threatened rivers and discussing the global approach. What do we talk about? So we're talking about several threats, multiple at the global level. Major work will be discussed later on. Work's been done on the impact of dams and the fragmentation processes that take place along the river reaches. Which of course fragment the continuums. Now, to illustrate my talk about the various threats, I will give you information I collected from a website called Global Surface Water Explorer, which uses Landsat images which analyze the water surfaces and the evolution of occurrence, between 8499 and 2021. In red, water surfaces tend to shrink between the two periods or to be reduced, whereas in green, there is more and more water. This is a great illustration with the Capsicoro Dam built during that period between Hungary and Slovakia, and we see the green zones, which is the reservoir, the dam, and the red zone is a loss of water leading associated with the anastomosis of the Danube in this region. So we see the impact of dam. We can look at other aspects, other phenomena such as global warming or global change, water increase, evaporation, water withdrawal. You can see in Phoenix, Arizona, the river has less and less water through the urban zone. And there are several green spots which corresponds to the advent of water surfaces, which are extraction zones. Then on the left of the screen, you see the Russian plains, or we can see that the anti-hydrographic river, the alluvial river, has more and more water, which correspond to hydroclimatic changes taking place. Beyond the withdrawal, there are also the aspects such as mining. This is the example of an article published in Nature. Clearly there is the impact of mining activities on the tropical rivers. You see the Rio Madres, all green spots are mine operations, which have, of course, to remove the trees and, of course, as impacting water. And then, of course, we got urban growth, urban sprawl, and pollution, associated with effluents. And this, of course, the Yamuna in Delhi or in the Ganges River in the Varanasi in India. And of course, there is withdrawal of water, then there is a great example of the Ahmedabad waterfront, while it is in the semi-arid zone, which has a high water deficit. But when you look at the change, it's still green, a lot of water, because they've taken water from other parts of India to supply water to this river, which has a high stress to drink. Beyond this, all those changes, all those threats have direct impacts on ecosystem services and biodiversity. If we take a look at the very recent work from the UICN, we can see that they shed a light on threats for the freshwater fish associated with climate change. So there are threats at the global scale, and it is quite a current topic. So threatened rivers. So what's going on at the global scale? I've shown you a series of local examples. Now, could we have, is it possible to have a kind of a global assessment? Is it severe or is it here and there? There could be some threats and or only some zone. Jeff Opperman will talk about dams later on, but one of the first summary work was done was to take stock of all the dams, see their transformation, the changes they caused, the impact they had on rivers and especially the fragmentation and the impact. You see, this is work from Christian Darfol et al. You see the impacts on biodiversity, and on megafauna. We try to analyze at global level zones where there is low diversity, high diversity, and basically to understand and identify the hotspots of such threats. Now, another stake or challenge, you see a first map here done by Mathis Messager and et al. On the non-perennial rivers and streams. We can see the withdrawal. This map will will evolve definitely, in the coming years. And this question of non-perennial rivers, low levels and so on and so forth, all this will have an impact. I've shown you the transformation of water surfaces. This is another project, interesting, which exploited this at the global level that was published in February 2023. And you can see in blue the type R, lots in China, in Brazil. Those are situations where there is more and more water, and they see it as kind of a hydropower dams, and the H-type situation where we see changes taking place towards the green, which would be then associated with hydroclimatic challenges or change or and the global changes. So N-type are more morphological. If you said yellow and blue, you see the change dynamics at the global level are quite striking. Now, what is at stake? Well, this we'll discuss the program of the day. Well, try to see if we can make things visible, things which are not visible, understand what's going on the scale of the globe, when, where, why, what are the drivers among all the threats, and how is this taking place, this change. Then the idea will be to discuss, to think this, to maybe open a discussion, and this is the purpose of our meeting today, to discuss solutions, possibly to prevent rather than to repair. As we say, when you need to repair, when you got to the stage of repairing, you never restore to the initial situation. What has been lost is lost forever. Now, we'll have four contributions to fuel this debate, this discussion. So Gérard Payen, first, who will talk about the governance issues, how to change things. Governance is essential. Jeff Opperman will discuss the environmental challenges. Victoria Chiu, who is a legal expert, will discuss the geopolitical challenges through cooperative law and the conflicts. And Barbara Belletti will discuss the specific case of a floodplain urban plan or urban development. So this is the menu of the day. Stop my sharing, and with no further ado, I give the floor to Gérard Payen, who knows the global governance, and we will guide us through this sphere.
So, Gérard, over to you. Gérard needs to switch his microphone on. So, hello, everybody. So, as Hervé Piégay said, he's asked me to talk about the influences on rivers, on decisions that are taken at global level. So, can you share your screen, Gérard, for us, please? Yep, it just needs a little bit of time. So, can you see my screen? Maybe you can't see it entirely, or can you? Can you see my screen? Yes, it's perfect. Thank you, Gérard. So as I was saying, you asked me to talk about the way rivers are impacted by global decisions. And I'm going to talk to you about this aspect from the point of view of three things: governance, vision, and world policies in relation to fresh water. So I'm going to start with governance. And let me just remind you that we all have a role to play. Everybody has a role to play. The state has a role to play, especially when they have rivers going through them. And there are many individual interactions. And these, of course, have to be coordinated. There are collective actions as well. So this means that there are political challenges and challenges in relation to good governance. Now, good governance is something that can be expressed at several levels. So if we take a river, we can use a blue triangle to represent the river. And we imagine that it's in a country and in a hydrographic basin. And there are two cases. The basin might be inside the country or across different countries. And it's in the world. In terms of governance, there are different levels and they're all important. There are local decisions that have an impact on the river. There are hydrographic basin decisions that impact the river. There are national decisions that also have an impact on the river. But there are also worldwide decisions, global decisions, and it's not as easy to understand those. And I will be talking about those. So at global level, as you know, there are 200 countries that are all autonomous and sovereign. And we can see them with these gray dots. These countries are located in specific areas, and they're part of a club. They're part of the United Nations, and that's the big green rectangle that represents the United Nations. But there are two other ways in which countries interact at international level when it comes to water. On the one hand, there are international treaties. There are UN treaties because they have been established under the aegis of the United Nations, but they don't engage all countries, only the countries who have wanted to be committed. And the treaties, there are different treaties, and you can see them according to the dotted blue lines. So some countries have international local treaties. So there are international treaties that are specific to a hydrographic basin or a part of a hydrographic basin, and they're shown on the diagram by ovals. So I've just included two, but in fact there are a lot more than that. Now at global level, let's talk at global level and United Nations level especially. How are things organized? So the decision makers are states at UN level. Then we've got civil society that counts less. So it's the states that are the decision makers. Now it's a bit complicated because states don't always make their decisions at the same places. There are three different places where decisions are taken. So the main place is the UN General Assembly, but they might also take decisions together when there is a meeting of a specialized agency of the General Assembly. If there's a health decision, for example, they use the World Health Organization. If it's an environmental decision, it's within the General Assembly of the UN Environment Programme, etc., etc. And then there's a third place where countries can take decisions. There are meetings of parties and international treaties. So this is more mediatized. So there's the Convention of Parties on the environment and climate change, for example, the Conference of Parties, on climate change. But there are other international treaties that are linked to the water resource. There are conferences of parties on these different treaties. So there are different ways in which states can express themselves. To take decisions, they get advice from international institutions. So there are specialized UN agencies, for example. There's a small list of these on the left-hand side with the FAO, UNESCO, etc., etc. But in terms of water, there are 30, a little bit more than 30 agencies. There's the agencies that do something when it comes to water. And there are many advisors who work for these agencies. So the states listen to the 8 billion people on the planet, civil society, via a structure where there are three main groups. That's the official term. In other words, individuals like us represent the UN via different categories of representation. And I haven't listed them all, but we just have a number. There are local authorities, there are academics, there are private companies, there are farmers, there are NGOs, young people, women. There are different categories. Some belong to several, but each structure has a spokesperson who talks to states in an official capacity. All of the organizations who want to influence decisions try and find the means of doing this by interacting directly with the states, by interacting with major groups who take over their message, or by interacting with the agencies of the United Nations. So that's how it works. Now, it can work. Let me give you an example. So last year, there was a historic conference on freshwater in New York, organized by the UN. France was represented in two ways. On the one hand, the French government sent over two ministers. So we can see the ministers on the photos, and they expressed themselves on behalf of the government. But then there was the French Water Partnership with the vice president, who also spoke in front of all of the governments to plead for three political messages that were the same messages as the ministers. So we managed to make sure that all of the French representatives said the same thing. And that actually brought results. So that's world governance, global governance. What about a global vision when it comes to water? If you look at this slide, and this is something that I have been using for 20 years, it explains what the main problems relating to water are across the planet. And there are four categories in terms of management: resources, ecosystems, access, control of pollution, disasters. And I usually explain that all of these problems are impacted by climate change and urban growth. So this is an overall vision of water. It's simplified, but it's pretty operational. Now, does the United Nations have this vision? No, not. In 2015, there was a political revolution inside the United Nations, however, and a program was adopted. The program aimed to deal with different humanity challenges, including water. So there was the Agenda 2030 that was set up that focused on environmental problems. For the first time, this program gave a holistic, integrated, comprehensive vision in terms of water problems and covered about 20 or so ambitious objectives relating to water. And these are shown in yellow on the diagram. They each have a number because they each have a specific objective and an indicator that's monitored. And they basically represent all major water problems. So that was a revolution at global level. And it's already brought with it a number of consequences. Since 2015, the climate COP, has acknowledged the problem of water especially when it comes to adapting to climate change. However, the impact of urban growth on water is not yet a shared subject when it comes to political decision makers. So since 2015, what's happened politically within the United Nations? Well, in terms of actions in relation to these objects, it's not many things. And that's what makes everybody frustrated. States are rather schizophrenic in the way they behave. They've got the goals are very ambitious, but states don't seem to have changed their public policies in a significant manner. And the UN has indicators explaining that to achieve the goals by 2030, we have to multiply by a factor of 6 the amount of progress. So it's just impossible. So that's not good. However, the SDGs have already had other impacts, like changes to statistical knowledge across the world. So today, thanks to these goals, we've built new indicators. It's taken time, but we've got these new indicators that have national and global values that are published. Everybody knows them. They're available to the decision makers, and this has changed the playing field when it comes to a certain number of subjects. So I can give you an example. This is similar to one of the diagrams shown by Hervé. So water stress, for example, is an indicator. It's something that we're familiar with for all countries. But what's more interesting than that is that we know what the water stress is for each basin. Now, in terms of tools, we've also made progress because at world level, we didn't have any tools that really allowed us to do something about SDGs and the program. So it's important to have tools. The French Water Partnership set up a tool called Water for All SDGs. And this makes it possible for any stakeholder or person working in the water world to answer questions about water in less than an hour and to detect all of the positive and negative impacts of a project just by pressing on a button and that covers all of the SDGs that are part of the 2030 program. Now, there's another important consequence that we need to mention. So the political trigger only occurred 8 years later in 2023 when there was a historic conference of the UN. For the first time, states came together in New York to talk about fresh water. And this is something that had never happened before. They only talked about it in bits. So this conference brought with it a result. All of the ministers said that they had water problems, and so they declared that there was a global water crisis, and that, of course, changed the way people saw water. And at last, they understood that they had to report on a regular basis. It's not about, talking about things bit by bit that things could be done. So the decision was taken that states should come together again under the aegis of the UN in 2026. Now, in terms of global governance, we still have a way to go because there's a lot of institutional fragmentation. Now, you know that rivers are fragmented, but institutions are also fragmented because there are different sector-based silos, and this affects the UN, but also countries. So in the United Nations, you have a certain number of specialized agencies that are listed in orange in the second column, for example. They each have a field of action. You've got the World Health Organization in charge of health, FAO that's in charge of agriculture, the United Nations Environment Programme that's in charge of environment, UN Habitat that's in charge of city ministries and construction. So each has its specific field. So water is a secondary subject for them. Now, in these agencies, who do you have? You've got states, representatives from states, but the decision makers are not always the same for the WHO. It's the ministers of health. For the it's ministers of agriculture. For the habitat, it's those in charge of equipment and construction works. For the UN, there's no political coordination when it comes to water specific decisions. And this comes from the institutional fragmentation that we have in governments, because the coordination of ministries for agriculture, health, and environment when it comes to water in most countries is very weak. So it's not their major priority. So that's a big problem, this institutional fragmentation. And hopefully in 2026, we'll be able to change this. So just to finish, let me come back to these two other governance aspects, global aspects. So there are UN treaties for boundary borders. The weak point is that there are very few signatories. So only 20% of the world population is covered by the signatories. So these conventions can definitely be improved. But there are many countries who are not part of these conventions because many countries don't want to be part of the conventions. They don't want to cooperate when it comes to water resources. There are countries who are doing everything to put a spanner in the works of any dialogue. So what about intergovernmental agreements relating to basins? There are quite a lot of these. There are many cross-border basins, and 2/3 have intergovernmental agreements. So there are twice as many for cross-border aquifers, and so, but only and a certain number of treaties that go with them. So some of the basins are full, some are half empty. We might say that there are not enough, but most of them are covered. At world level, at global level, cross-border cooperation is a political objective, and it's one of the different SDGs. There's an official decision, determination to make sure that there are cooperation agreements for all cross-border areas, but agreements that actually work, that are useful, that are very specific when it comes to what they define. I won't go into details, but you've got some information in the blue. So there is, for example, the Office for the Development of the Senegal River. So it's an office that's in charge of regulating the river, its dams and hydropower production, but it's also in charge of social and environmental questions. It's in charge of the economic life of the neighboring populations, but while focusing on the river's ecosystems. So these organizations have their own global organization with a number, quite a considerable number of members. So just to finish, and conclude my presentation. So there are governance tools at global level, and the SDGs have global objectives that are very much relevant. The 20 global goals all concern rivers. So that's important when it comes to understanding rivers. Unfortunately, not all states are cooperating, which limits the amount of action that the UN can do and international treaties. So there are international institutions dedicated to basins. They're very useful, but we need states and parties to be active and do things, otherwise they don't work. And I'll finish by saying that in my experience, for governance to work properly in relation to a river, it's important that there be a dedicated institution that brings together all of the stakeholders. And the essential point when it comes to governance is it's much more important than imagining that a river might have a legal status as a person, which is what some people are talking about. In my opinion, this creates just obstacles. In my opinion, it's much better to have dedicated
Merci beaucoup,
institutions. Thank
Gérard,
you
pour
very
cette
much, Gérard
présentation.
Payen, for that
Est-ce que vous avez
presentation.
des questions?
Are there any
Il y a 5 minutes
questions?
de
We've
questions
got
qui ont
5
été
minutes for
prévues
questions.
initialement, donc n'hésitez pas à
So
poser
please
vos
feel
questions
free if you
directement,
have any
soit
questions.
en levant la main
So you can
via
raise your
la
hand
petite barre en dessous, soit en
using
posant vos
the
questions dans le
bottom
chat.
bar,
On
or
pourra
you
les
can
transmettre
ask your
à
questions
ceux qui
via the
auront
chat and we can pass them on
envie.
directly to Gérard Payen. I have one just to kick things off if we have no questions in the chat. So you talked about interbasin agreements and you underlined the importance of dedicated institutions or specific authorities, dedicated authorities in Europe. So these interbasin agreements, uh, in these interbasin agreements, can we define a dedicated institution? I'm thinking about the Mekong River Commission, but maybe that has nothing to do with what you mentioned. Yes, my answer is yes. So I gave you some figures. Two-thirds of the basins are regulated by an international agreement, as I said. So there's the 5.2 indicator as well that's used. So that's an operational intergovernmental agreement. So there is a common organization and common action. What I am not able to assert is whether these organizations, beyond the states, parties, and agreements, associate all of the stakeholders, the local populations, people who are in charge of agriculture or economic development or the environment. I think these things exist, but I'm not sure whether they're systematic or not. So apparently we have a question. Yes, thank you very much, Payen, for your presentation. I'm in charge of an agreement in terms of durability. So it's a UNESCO river treaty that I'm trying to support colleagues in Brazil in order to set up a basin committee to protect Paraguay basins. It's quite difficult, in fact, because there are some big initiatives for transforming the upper part into a canal that's going to dry the biggest wetlands in the world. Are you aware of any institutions that might help to set up this kind of organization? We've talked to the CIPRA, the International Committee for the Protection of the Rhine. We organized a Latino Day with several groups from South America and the West Indies. Everybody has ideas to set up a steering committee for the CIPRA, at least, in order to develop durability or sustainability projects together. But, we all have the same problem. We need an international institution to help. Do you have any suggestions? Yes, what I can suggest is this. First of all, let me open a parenthesis and say that when it comes to these 5.2 global indicator and cross-border matters, France has lots of treaties with its Belgian neighbors, German neighbors, etc. And when we looked at statistics, we realized that our rating was very bad because we'd forgotten the two rivers along Guyana. And since then, France has focused on this question and it's taken up discussions that are quite promising with Brazil. I'm talking about this because Brazil hasn't always been very cooperative when it comes to transborder issues, but today with France, it is being cooperative. And it's one of the countries that is part of the Paraguay Basin organization. So that's my parenthesis. So what else can I give you in terms of ideas? Well, perhaps I can say that maybe you should contact the International basin organization. It's the only place where you will find people who might give you neutral advice when it comes to, how to set up an intergovernmental organization. So the secretariat of this organization is in Paris. The director is Éric Tardieu, and I can give you his contact details if you would like to contact him. But it's also possible to contact the secretariat of the International Treaty, the convention in Geneva. It's the UNEC, the UN Economic Commission for Europe, that's in charge of the secretariat. And then there's the Global Secretariat for this treaty. These are people who are in contact, who are, au fait with all of these transborder issues. So I can give you their contact details. Yes, that would be very useful. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for these questions. I can see that Emmanuel and Fanny also have questions, and Barbara has also added a question. What I suggest is that I make a note of them, and maybe we can ask these questions at the end when we have the questions and answers, so that we can move on to the next speaker. So we will hand over to Jeff Opperman for the next presentation.
Thank you. Let me share my screen. Great. Okay, so I'll be talking about challenges to river ecosystems during a period of global transitions and opportunities for river protection and restoration. So when thinking about the benefits we get from rivers, we often focus on rivers as connected systems. Connectivity between the land and the ocean, connectivity between the mountains and the sea, between the river and the floodplain. This underpins many of the benefits that come from rivers. But another set of benefits comes from rivers when we dam rivers, create reservoirs, regulate flows. But if we think of river ecosystems as thriving on connectivity, then we realize that dams are the great fragmenter of that connectivity. So this sets up an inherent conflict and set of trade-offs between the benefits we get from rivers that are free-flowing and connected, and the benefits we get from rivers when they are regulated. And balancing those trade-offs is one of the great challenges we face in the future. And this is underscoring the scale of that challenge. This is the grand database that shows reservoirs and dams. And you can see, just, don't worry about the numbers, just visually, there are dams on rivers all across the world, particularly in the United States, Europe, India, China, parts of South America, parts of Africa. Now, the flip side is what is not dammed. And these are the free-flowing rivers of the world. This was a paper, the lead author was Gunter Grill, but my colleague at WWF, Michelle Team, was really the driver behind this research. And so this was the first time that scientists around the world came up with a consensus definition of what is a free-flowing river, what are the characteristics that create a free-flowing river, and then map them around the world. And here the free-flowing rivers are in blue, non-free-flowing rivers are in red, and the thicker the line is, the longer the river. So that's why it's kind of like a spaghetti, looks like a plate of spilled spaghetti. But the rivers of the Amazon basin, the rivers of the Congo basin, the rivers that flow towards the Arctic Sea, these all stand out as the free-flowing rivers of the world. It's the negative image of this. So we see Europe, China, India, United States have they have no large free-flowing rivers. You'd have to zoom in to see the smaller free-flowing rivers. And then in Asia, what really stands out is the Salween and the Irrawaddy, two free-flowing rivers large free-flowing rivers that exist in South Asia, Southeast Asia, or East Asia, really. So this is the extent of free-flowing rivers in the world. And this is a large explanation for why freshwater ecosystems and populations have declined. This is something called the Living Planet Index. It's a number that WWF puts out every 2 years in the Living Planet report. It's an index of over 30,000 distinct populations of vertebrates that have been tracked over time, and their abundance is tracked over time. And then the Living Planet Index consolidates that into an overall trend for the Earth. It's a little bit like a stock index that puts together a whole bunch of stocks and attracts the overall market. This is the market of vertebrates, of wildlife. And those vertebrates depend on freshwater, lakes, rivers, wetlands, have declined about twice as fast as populations that live on land or in the ocean. So there's a true crisis in biodiversity and wildlife in freshwater. And studies have consistently shown that the primary driver of this loss of biodiversity is infrastructure that fragments rivers. So dams that fragment longitudinal connectivity, and levees, flood walls, other things that fragment lateral connectivity. So that's sort of where we have gotten to from the past to today. But thinking about the future going forward, again, toggling back and forth between where are the free-flowing rivers and where are hydropower dams in the planning process. And we can see that in much of the world that today has free-flowing rivers, such as the Amazon and the Congo, there are dams planned that would fragment those rivers. And in Asia, if we look on the Saline and Irrawaddy. And what would happen if those dams were to be built? This was research led by Michelle's team. And in yellow are rivers that were previously free-flowing that would no longer be free-flowing if those hydropower dams were to be built. And all the benefits that come with those free-flowing rivers, including the sediment delivery to deltas, migratory fish, these are not just biodiversity, these are some of the more important ecosystem services that rivers provide. And we can see there would be a fairly dramatic change in free-flowing rivers around the world. And this breaks it down by continent. These are the percent of the long rivers, the big rivers in each continent that would be that are free flowing today, and that would be free flowing after those proposed hydropower dams were built. We can see 65% loss of free flowing rivers in South America, almost a 50% loss in Africa, and about a 25% loss in Asia. And that's the 25% loss in Asia is the Irrawaddy and the Saline. So essentially, it's a 100% loss of the non-North Pole Asia rivers. So this is a dramatic loss of a major global ecosystem type. And I'll note, it's not the main point of my talk, but I'll note that all those hydropower dams that would result in this loss of this major global ecosystem type would provide less than 1% of the energy needed by 2050. So it's a major loss of a global ecosystem type for essentially a rounding error in the energy landscape of 2050. But beyond thinking about hydropower, flood control is also, flood risk is also changing. This is a figure that shows projections of how flood risk would change in the future with climate change. The areas in blue, it's essentially showing what is today the 1 in 100 return period flood, what that return period would be by 2100. And we can see in some parts of the world, what is today a rare flood, the 1% exceedance probability flood, could become the kind of flood that happens multiple times per decade, or even at the extreme in the dark blue, it becomes every other year type of flood, meaning it becomes essentially a common flood rather than an unusual flood. And so that's the areas in blue, and you see that's pretty extensive areas, including not just the tropics, because it's fairly universal across the tropics, but also much of the eastern United States, where the population is concentrated, along with the western coast of the United States, and then northern Europe, northern France, Germany, UK, Netherlands, etc. This will drive more demand for infrastructure. More demand for dams and levees. Drought risk is already a major challenge. This is research from Kate Brauman that shows depletion at various time scales, dry year, seasonal, annual depletion. But these water shortages are already affecting about half the world's population and about 3/4 of the world's irrigation agriculture. And climate change is anticipated to increase the frequency of droughts. So that includes many of the areas that are already somewhat dry, and many of the world's kind of breadbaskets, if you think about the major wheat growing regions. So all of this is going to drive demand for more storage and more infrastructure. So you can see the trade-offs that trying to navigate maintaining the benefits of free-flowing rivers would become increasingly difficult in this period of global transitions and global transformations. And yeah, this is what I was supposed to be on this slide. But if we think about the future going forward, and this is our current state of free flowing rivers, the combination of the drive for more hydropower, dealing with increased water stress and water scarcity, and dealing with increased flood risk is going to be a major challenge for maintaining free flowing rivers. So I'm going to take a pause for a moment here and just say, I'm wondering how many of you have been thinking about the Roman Empire while I've been talking. And that may seem like a very unusual thing, but to ask, but I was fascinated because a couple months ago I read that there's this phenomenon where women in the United States have been asking their husbands or boyfriends, how often do you think about the Roman Empire? And they say multiple times per day. And so, yes, it seems that men think about the Roman Empire a lot. I'm not sure why, but women, I mean, why they do, but women started putting this on social media and other people did it. And this is the New York Times that actually wrote about this, that apparently men think about the Roman Empire. And I thought, oh, this is kind of silly. And then I realized that my metaphor for how we should deal with these challenges and these trade-offs, my metaphor is based on ancient Rome. So I guess I am also one of those people who thinks about the Roman Empire, maybe a surprising amount. So what is my metaphor that involves the Roman Empire? Well, if we think about climate change as the world is confronting a number of challenges that seem unprecedented, that seem a total break from the past. And if we go back to 2nd century BC, the Roman military was facing something they had never seen before. They were being pushed around on the Italian peninsula by Hannibal, because Hannibal, and they were seeing war elephants for the first time, because Hannibal had very famously crossed the Rhone. Well, he went through Spain from Africa. He crossed the Rhone River on rafts. That's what you see here. Then he crossed the Alps, building all kinds of bridges and structures to get the elephants over the Alps, and then descended on to Italy, and was shocking the military, and a series of dramatic victories for Hannibal, and shocking defeats for the Roman Empire. And they were now the enemy was headed towards the gates of Rome. This is Hannibal on the left there, and they did not know what to do. So it was time for Quintus Fabius Maximus Verrucus, who thankfully is just known as Fabian. He was a general that was then appointed to deal with Hannibal and this incredibly shocking new reality that they were facing. So he devised what's called the Fabian strategy. And this is actually a strategy that you can still find in military strategy books. It's a style of fighting that is still used and was popularized by Fabian here, confronting this superior opponent. So rather than fighting Hannibal's army directly, and rather than confronting them at the walls of Rome, he decided to divert and deflect and to dodge and to try to get small bits of Hannibal's army on favorable terrain, basically deal with the threat on terrain that is favorable to your advantage, and don't deal with the threat on the terrain that is to your opponent's advantage. And so initially the Roman Senate was horrified. They said, Romans stand and fight. We don't duck and dodge. But it worked. It actually worked. It allowed Rome to regroup. It allowed them to survive this new reality and to move forward. Okay, so enough now of me thinking about ancient Rome. And you'll say, what am I talking about? And I'll say, okay, well, I would say that nature-based solutions can be thought of as a Fabian strategy for floods, dealing with floods and rivers. Essentially, the essence is confront this challenge on favorable terrain, divert, deflect wherever you can. Don't confront this challenge at your own gates. Don't confront it on terrain that's favorable to the opponent, so to speak, but on terrain that's favorable. That's where nature-based solutions come in. They're an attempt to deal with this challenge on favorable terrain. So my example for this is the city of Sacramento in California. If you know California history, there was a gold rush in 1848, a massive growth in population. I think California became a state in 1859 or 1850, and immediately the capital, Sacramento, got hit by a huge flood. So the newspaper at the time said, it will be seen that Sacramento City can be easily protected against inundations and, at comparatively small expense. So that was a very breezy, light and breezy headline, but easily? Not really. Over the next several decades, multiple floods flooded the capital city over and over. And essentially, the opponent, the flood, was at the gates, was at the walls of the capital city. They had to come up with something else. They tried for about 40 years to take the floods on head on. They kept building levees, they built them higher. They had fascinating levee wars where one side of the river would build them higher than the other. They even had one side trying to dynamite the other side to try to relieve pressure on their levees. It was a crazy time in California history, but eventually the engineers came up with this solution. They would take a Fabian approach to Sacramento floods. Rather than confronting the floods in Sacramento, they reconnected everything you see in red. This is a map of the current today flood management system in the Sacramento Valley, but everything in red was reconnected to the river in the 1930s after they'd given up on this 40, 50 years of battling the floods head on. And they divert and deflect the floods away from the walls, away from the levees, away from Sacramento, into this floodplain. And this is what it looks like. This is the weir that allows the river, when it's at flood stage, to flood on the right. That's a loop in the river. On the left is the 40,000 hectares of floodplain in these bypasses. And just to take a quick little trip back to Rome, where is this diversion point? It's at a place called Verona. And of course, when I Googled Verona, it says it's a Roman town founded in the 2nd century BCE, which is when Hannibal was ransacking Italy. So I thought, oh, that's quite appropriate. Both of my stories involve Verona. So in a world of transitions and transformations, don't fight the elephants, work with them. This is me having fun with DALL-E, the AI drawing tool. I said, show a picture of Roman soldiers cooperating with elephants. And that's what they came up with. I thought that was kind of funny. Okay, and now what does this have to do with the challenge I laid out at the beginning, the connectivity, the ecosystems, the LPI? I've been talking about flood safety and all that. And that's, of course, super important. And that's what's going to be driving a lot of attention to rivers. Not necessarily biodiversity, but flood, keeping people safe is going to be driving attention to rivers. If we can promote nature-based solutions, if we can promote this idea that managing floods on terrain that is favorable to managing those floods, that favorable terrain is also known as wetlands and floodplains and things that have enormous benefit to ecosystems. So this is the Yolo bypass while it's flooding. There's Sacramento in the upper right-hand corner, Interstate 80 crossing the Yolo bypass. But along the way, researchers began to discover that juvenile Chinook, that native fish were using this habitat. It was obvious that birds were using this habitat because they were everywhere, but native fish were using this habitat. And it took almost 50 years before fish biologists realized this, that underneath these waters were the native fish. This had become the biggest and most connected floodplain habitat that was left in the whole Central Valley. And what was happening is that juvenile Chinook that went out in the floodplain were benefiting from all the benefits of the floodplain productivity. It's called, the flood pulse advantage, and fisheries biologists talk about it on the Mekong and the Amazon. Well, it was happening on the Sacramento, where the fish on the right of this photo were living in the floodplain, and the fish on the left were living in the river. And we can see that the fish that got access to the floodplain were growing much faster. These fish all started the same size. They were experimental fish from a hatchery, and they were raised in these different habitats. So reconnecting floodplains, not just a way to keep people safe, but it could potentially be a way to get to bend the curve back up. We see the LPI curve is going down. We need to bend it back up. Reconnecting floodplains through nature-based solutions could be an important way to do that. And if we look at the blue, all of these parts of the world that are going to be having increased flood risk, can they integrate nature-based solutions the first time? On the Sacramento River, they did it after they leveed. On the Mississippi River, they also reconnected big floodways after. We have room for the river in the Netherlands, but that was after. They already had the levees. Can these parts of the world get it right the first time and integrate nature-based solutions? I'm not saying not build levees anywhere. Definitely build levees and flood walls where they're needed, but to the extent possible, integrate nature-based solutions, not just to benefit biodiversity, but it's a way to keep people safe. Now, the same thing of reconnecting floodplains, and I'll just, because I'm running into my last 30 seconds, but you can use floodplains to recharge aquifers. It's called managed aquifer recharge. So California is exploring this as well, about the same floodplains that can be used to reduce flood risk can be used to recharge aquifers. This can be another way to store water without building new dams and reservoirs. And again, there will probably be a need for dams and reservoirs, but can we integrate natural storage to the extent possible as we go forward? And I really don't have time for talk about that, so I will conclude. I think this is the Pont de Garde in France, but just wanted to end with an image that has the Roman Empire and rivers and thinking about those lessons for nature-based solutions. Thank you.
Merci, merci Jeff pour cette présentation sur les enjeux de conservation et la question des solutions.
Thank you, Jeff, for this presentation and the nature-based solutions as one of the opening. So, do we have questions? Do we have questions to Jeff? Comments?
Yes, I had a question. I was wondering if there was any dams that implemented ecological corridors that managed to preserve biodiversity while still having an efficient energy production system?
Yeah, so that's a great question because it brings up another set of solutions that the world is not going to be divided between fragmented dammed rivers and free-flowing rivers. There are, or let's just say, it's not as if every dammed river is no longer a river that produces multiple benefits. And so I believe that what you're referring to is the concept of environmental flows, and that is a way to revisit, to assess the way a dam is operated, and to determine if there's ways to manage the release of water from the dam in ways that could protect or restore. And there are some very good examples. In the Washington State, there's been some really good reoperation of hydropower dams to improve spawning of salmon. I mean, sometimes it's as simple as realizing that dam operators were dropping flow levels after the spawning season, and so all of these salmon nests had became dewatered, and they just began to drop their flows after the salmon had already emerged from their redds, from their nests. So I mean, that's just a simple example about how a change in operations could dramatically improve ecological performance.
Est-ce qu'on a une autre question? One more question. You have one from Matthias in the chat, Jeff, so you will answer it a bit perhaps later. A last one is about the nature-based solution. Is this taken into account by the world governance, or is it something that is completely new?
And by that, I'm wondering if it's meaning these different commitments, global conventions, I mean, one thing I'll say is that there's the Global Biodiversity Framework, which has targets that 180 countries agree to. And their targets around protecting 30% of freshwater habitats around the world. And then their targets also around restoration of freshwater habitats. And there's something called the Freshwater Challenge, that's led by a group of governments. WWF, my organization, has been working hard with these governments to get these commitments, and they're trying to make specific commitments to restoration that are aligned with the Global Biodiversity Framework commitments of protection and restoration. And it's still emerging, but I would suggest that thinking about things like floodplains, large scale for protection of floodplains, or even reconnection of floodplains where it makes sense, should be part of this global biodiversity framework about how we protect and how we restore freshwater ecosystems.
Thank you, Jeff. You have one more question in the chat for your homework. So thank you for your presentation. And so the next speaker, Victoria Chiu, va nous parler des enjeux, les défis géopolitiques.
We'll talk about geopolitical challenge at the global scale, and especially in relation with law and conflict situations. Victoria.
Thank you. So I'm going to share my screen. So hello, everybody. I'm going to try and draw a picture that's quite broad as possible. In 20 minutes, that's actually quite difficult. It's not very much time to give you an overall vision of how law addresses rivers and watercourses. But first of all, I'm going to just take a look at international law and then the laws that we have in different countries, and especially in America and in Latin America. And then I'll zoom in on Asia through the example of India. So concerning rivers and law, of course, rivers have been dealt with, have been treated since Roman times. They've been addressed. Now, international rivers are addressed. They've been addressed since the 19th century through international law, and more generally on a global level as of 1920 with the permanent International Court of Justice, where international law focused on watercourses, and there were international agreements that were signed by different states. Now, international rivers irrigate different continents. We've already mentioned that. There are different regions across the world that are crossed by international rivers. Today, there are about 250 international watercourses. States, so neighboring states, there are quite a lot of these. This is the case of the Nile Basin. There are 11 neighboring countries, and that's why there's cooperation that can be set up. And that can include lots of problems. So rivers depend on political relations. There are lots of asymmetries when it comes to power. You can see these between neighboring countries, and that's why treaties are drawn up to reflect this particular aspect. Then there are states that don't want to cooperate, and that can create an obstacle to the adoption of a treaty or its possible modification to take into account changes in environmental challenges, but especially, how we deal with those challenges. So there are conflicts. There are many conflicts linked to the building of dams or diversion of water, pollution of water, and access to potable water as a fundamental right. There are factors that increase these tensions and conflicts. We've already mentioned some earlier on with the demographic growth, growth in uses, conflicts of use, the effects of climate change. So, what about international law? How does international law deal with rivers? Well, first of all, the word river is not used as such in law. It's the word international watercourse that is used. So there are different legal instruments as well that are used with respect to international water courses. There are basin agreements, there are universal instruments, so basically international conventions that are signed and that are open to signing and ratification by all states that are members of the UN. There are regional instruments, so at more local level. And in the case where states have no treaty or agreement or convention, when there's a dispute, when there's some kind of conflict between neighboring countries, the customary principles of international law apply. This was the case notably with respect to the recent dispute between Chile and Bolivia with respect to the Silala River, which is an international river. And the question was to know whether an international river, if you apply could you apply international law to an international river? And the International Court of Justice concluded that yes, it's an international river. And given that there was no treaty, then the customary principles of international law applied. There are also basin agreements. So, for example, there's the Amazon Cooperation Treaty of 1978, or the Cooperation Agreement for the Sustainable Development of the Mekong River Basin that dates back to 1995. There are the most well-known universal instruments, for example, like the 1997 United Nations Convention on the Law of the Non-Navigational Uses of International Water Courses. And then, so this relates to the use of international watercourses with respect to uses that are non-navigational. So this is interesting to note. This entered into force not long ago in 2014. So it took a long time for it to be applied. And there were different people who didn't take part in the convention, like China. China is not a party to that convention. And the two conventions that we've just mentioned define what cross-border waters are in terms of the convention. So it's all groundwater and surface water that cross the states or that are located along the borders. Now, concerning the definition of the international watercourse, so this is the 1997 convention that gave us the definition. It's a watercourse that corresponds to surface water, groundwater, making up a unitary assembly or ensemble. So the convention of 1997 is a little bit more comprehensive. It has an ecosystem-based approach when it comes to protection and use and sharing of international waters. Now, after that, there are other examples of legal instruments at regional level, notably for the African continent. We can cite the revised protocol for shared watercourses dated back to 2000 concerning the Community for Southern African Development. So, concerning the Convention of the United Nations of 1997, as I was saying, this is a convention that has an ecosystem-based approach in terms of use and protection of these watercourses. In its preamble, it's notable to see that the states and parties assert that this convention will make it possible to use and value, preserve and manage and protect international watercourses and promote the optimal use and lasting use today and in the future. So there's a transgenerational approach that was adapted through this preamble. Now, what are the main general principles in terms of international law when it comes to water? Well, there are different principles that are obligatory and that apply. So all states have to respect these, and more specifically, the states signatories of the convention have stronger obligations, and states who haven't signed the convention, as I was saying, into the customary principles of international law are applied to these states. And the legal consequence is not quite as high. So the sharing of water and the benefits. So the aim is to have fair and reasonable use of water, and there's an obligation not to cause any significant damage. So the bordering countries have to follow this obligation. Then there's a general obligation when it comes to cooperation to avoid any damage being caused to the watercourse in question. Now, among these general principles, there's also the protection of the environment that has to be taken into account. And more specifically, the bordering countries must protect the ecosystems, the aquatic ecosystems. They have to fight against pollution. And there are general principles of international law on water. And for example, things become concrete with the obligation that is based on case law, and that came up thanks to the work of the International Court of Justice, because the court outlines this obligation to respect a minimum environmental flow rate. So each bordering state must respect that and has the obligation to do environmental assessments when a state is thinking of setting up a project that might have a considerable damaging effect on the water course in question. Then there's another general principle that has to be applied and respected, and that is the prevention and settlement of disputes so that conflicts can be avoided. And if there are conflicts, these have to be settled. There's an obligation to settle disputes, therefore. And then finally, there's another general principle, and that is making sure that priority is given to essential human needs when it comes to water. So access to potable water has to be considered as a priority, and the participation of the public also has to be guaranteed. Now, of course, when we talk about international water courses, as they're at the heart of different rivalries when it comes to policies and bordering states, disputes do arise. And the question is, how do we settle these disputes? Because these disputes have to be settled. So it's about international safety and peace, after all. Now, international law has different settlement mechanisms for these conflicts. So there might be something that's judiciary with the intervention of the International Court of Justice or a specific court. The states have to recognize the authority of that court or the tribunal in question. The settlement might be diplomatic, in which case international organizations have an important role to play when it comes to settling conflicts. You can also have conventional settlements. So it's the treaty itself that outlines the conditions for settling the dispute. And from an institutional point of view, in other words, treaties focusing on an international watercourse that outline the conditions for creating a basin, and they say that this basin committee has the authority for settling conflicts that may arise. So concerning the settlement of different disputes of international water courses, the role of the ICJ is very important because this jurisdiction has case law, very solid case law when it comes to international water courses. There are different environmental requirements that are taken into account. So it's something that's evolved over the course of time in order to take into account this aspect and also to take into account local life, because you have local life along cross-border water courses. So it has to take into account the life of, indigenous peoples who are not necessarily familiar with the fact that even if it's an international water course that is used as a border between states, the border disappears when it's a question of local life. So you can also have disputes settled thanks to an arbitration court, a court chosen by the states who are in the middle of a conflict. So using this kind of court is provided for by the treaty itself. So, for example, here's a 100-year decision relating to the dam of Kishanganga, dating back to 2013, where India was opposed to Pakistan, and it concerned the share and use of the Indus water. So it was considered that the project had to be finalized, taking into account the possible future variations with respect to determining the minimum flow rate required. If 7 years after diversion of the Kishanganga-Neelam water course came into play, one or other of the parties could ask for a review of the flow rate that was decided on beforehand by addressing their request to the permanent committee. Now, these decisions become definite, but this arbitration court says that everything is possible, that any decision has to take into account changes relating to climate change. So, for example, it's quite possible to review any minimum environmental flow rate. So it could be heightened or lowered. Then there's the diplomatic role of international organizations that needs to be mentioned. So there is the signing of the treaties relating to the Indus. So there was a treaty that was signed in 1960. It was concluded thanks to a diplomatic initiative that lasted for about 10 or so years. And it was initiated by the International Bank for the Reconstruction and Development of the area. So it's a treaty that was drawn up by the Indus Committee, and the idea was to settle any problems. So conflicts could be settled by the committee itself or by the appointment of a neutral expert, appointment by the state, or by an arbitration court. So the choice, of course, is for the states to make. So the most suitable means need to be chosen. Next, what about national laws and rivers? So there are very many different legal instruments. So everything will depend on whether it's a unitary state, whether it's centralized, whether it's decentralized. And in that case, the legislation is going to be fairly uniform. It will apply at national level. So there's only one state involved, only one government involved that adopts and follows the legislation. But in the case of a federal state, for example, India or Latin America, Argentina, Brazil, Mexico, and Venezuela, there things become a little bit more complicated because we've got federal legislation, but also you have legislation of the federated state. And in terms of authorities and the split of authorities, you can have conflicts and different problems arising. After that, we can talk about national legal strategies aiming to protect watercourses and lakes. In other words, if states don't manage to sign any treaties to protect an international watercourse, there are other strategies that can be implemented. And among these strategies, there is the recognition of watercourses as subjects of law. So this is the idea of imposing on the state, a state that is not doing its job and protecting the river. So it's a way of encouraging the state to act in favor of the protection of the watercourse. So this recognition can be direct. It's recognition that can be given by national judges. This was the case in Colombia and India, for example. It can also be indirect, this recognition. It can be imposed by the national constitution. This was the case in Bolivia or Ecuador, notably via the recognition for the law of nature. So the recognition of rivers as a legal entity. Or you can have recognition through national texts, such as this is the case in New Zealand. So in March 2017, the Parliament of New Zealand passed legislation recognizing the legal personhood of the Wanganui River. We had something similar going on in India. And so this all started in March 2017. And then, so the High Court of Utah and India handed down judgment stating that the Ganges and the Yamuna, one of its tributaries, should be considered as living legal persons, and the other states followed suit. And this was, and then there was another case in Ecuador in 2011 that was similar. In Ecuador, more recently, the Constitutional Court recognized an urban river as a river with legal personhood, the Vilcabamba River. And there were certain, so the municipality of the capital, Quinto, was obliged to maintain and protect the river and make sure that wastewater that was discharged directly into the river was no longer discharged into the river, because this increased the flow rate of the river with the consequences of creating pollution along the banks of the river. So this is the river. So you can see that there's an awful lot of urban development around that river. So you can see that there are real problems. So that court also obliged the municipality to adopt zoning and a development plan for the area. And so the municipality had to take into account the different blue and green corridors in order to protect especially the banks of that river. Now, there's the state of India that we can mention. India is a state, a federal state with 28 federated states. So you can see this from the picture on the screen. Sorry about that. Sorry. So in India, the problem is that there are no legal rules that are restrictive to get the states to prevent and manage the risk of flooding. And the federal state doesn't have the authority to make sure that the area is developed and to impose pricing when it comes to the flood plains, the alluvial plains. So there are 3 states out of 28 that are going to adopt laws on zoning. they're not really applied in practice, but there are others, especially the Ga and the Sam, have made a marked opposition to this kind of planning. And there are two reasons that might explain their reticence: the requirements when it comes to evacuating people when the plane is flooded and resettling these people elsewhere. And that's because of the shortage of land, and the economic cost is also quite considerable. However, we can notice the important role of the National Green Tribunal of India. It can impose things on the federated states. It's the only thing that can, the only a tribunal that can impose this zoning. It was created in 2010 based on an article of the Indian Constitution. So it's a tribunal that can act. It has a very original composition with technical experts and judicial members. This tribunal has handed down several decisions relating to the obligation to adopt zoning for floodable plains. So you can see, for example, that there are extracts of the decision. Sorry about that. So we've got extracts from the decision that talk about the concept of floodplain zoning. So a very important decision. So you can read through that. So the court talks about the obligations, the very strong obligations. So the environmental, the Green Tribunal notes that these decisions are not often applied or put into practice. So it's also important to keep in mind that the tribunal says that it's quite possible to envisage the demolition of certain constructions in the framework of this kind of planning, because these constructions might find themselves in a zone where there is a high risk of flooding. So as I was saying, there are legal decisions taken that the Green Tribunal well, it doesn't have much authority when it comes to application of these decisions. Thank you. Thank you very much, Victoria, for that presentation. We're not going to be able to take too many questions given the time that is slipping away. Manuel, I can see that you've asked a question in the chat. Is there anybody, are there any questions that you would like to ask now, or anybody else? Perhaps, yes. So the legal personhood of rivers, I was surprised that that's decided on river by river in the countries concerned in New Zealand or Ecuador. Why not have all rivers benefit from this legal personhood? Why is that? Well, because it's a national decision. The International Court of Justice cannot recognize the legal personhood of all rivers. It doesn't have that authority. And it's a question of authority, basically. But in Ecuador, it's the national Ecuadorian courts, no? Yes, yes, the Constitutional Court of Ecuador concerning the part of the river that's on its territory. But why didn't it make all of the rivers legal persons? Well, that's a different question, indeed. Yeah, that was my question, in fact. So it's quite possible that the argument that's brought up by the parties was linked to the recognition of such of different rivers. It relates to the arguments that were brought up. So if the parties don't talk about these arguments, the court doesn't deal with them. It just deals with the requests that are made. So there is a success story of the International Court of Justice, though, and I think you answered the case of Pakistan. Is that a most emblematic success story? Yes, at a more global level, yes. The role of the International Court of Justice is very important. It's an important instrument for taking into account environmental requirements and obligations. Thank you very much for those answers. If you have other questions for Victoria, I suggest that you keep them in mind and maybe bring them up at the end when we have our questions and answer session. I'm now going to hand over to Barbara Belletti for the last presentation.
So I will talk about the Glow Hub project, which was initiated slightly over a year ago. And today I'm the spokesperson for the project. And I would like to thank the work done by all my colleagues. I would like to thank the PhD students, we called of the group of the Glow Hub project. And you see the names on display because they're doing most of the work now. So Glow Hub looks at the urban growth situation in the world, as you've seen in some of the presentation, is associated with the growth or demographic growth, which is more and more urban, as we can see on this map. Today, you see 1,868 municipalities with more than 300,000 inhabitants, and especially the black ones, say 868 agglomerations. But the yellow and red, you see the large megalopole and metropoles with more 5 million plus 5 plus 10 million, and in white, the cities which have multiplied their population by 50 in the last 50 years. And in orange, there will be huge growth of the population in 2035. So you can see that this is a global phenomenon, but this is taking place, especially in some countries, in West Africa, in India, and in China. So what's the link with the floodplains? Well, half of these 860 agglomerations or cities are within alluvial plains or floodplains. So it concerns about 1.5 billion people. But anyway, if we take a look how the floodplains are located in terms of urban growth, well, we can see that cities are concentrated in some zones, and usually they occupy less than 10% of the floodplains for each continent, and we excluding Asia. So this is something we have at the scale of the world, which is the urban growth degree, and we've increased also the alluvial plains in the world. So this is just to tell you that the urban growth is, we can see hotspots all, in Europe with the Danube and the Rhine River, or the Ganga, Brahmaputra in India, the Nile in Africa. So why do we pay attention to floodplains? Well, Jeff said it to us early on, and Hervé, because they do represent a small surface area of the Earth, but they play a key role to support life on Earth, and also they provide a lot of services to a society, but also to the cities which, in fact, because of the other activities, anthropic activities present in plains, well, will threaten plains and will threaten all the ecosystems and the associated services. But what the observation we've made is that we are not yet able, well, we're a bit blind, but we don't know exactly where are the most impacted floodplains today, and what is the share of urban planning in this, or urban growth, and which are the location less impacted, what are the trade, demographic growth, or is it maybe the urban sprawl, and what for man, for ecosystems, and how can we identify changes which take place as a function of urban growth? How can we monitor? How can we inform? How can we prevent, and so on? So all this, for this observation, that we established another project, these hypothesis the project, And therefore, the first hypothesis that we do is that the urban growth is not just associated with global demographic growth, but it's a process, and the effect will vary throughout the world. And then we also come with the hypothesis that urban growth is a major threat for ecosystems and landscapes of floodplains. And the other hypothesis is that the urban growth in Blend could be the source of conflicts, of inequalities, and associated with environmental issues, but which may lead to local actions and which make it possible to minimize the impact. Now, to discuss this subject, we organized a interdisciplinary consortium with 5 labs, French labs, and therefore we work in river geomorphology, environmental, terrestrial aquatic morphology, signals, economy, compared law, and also we have a committee of international experts to help us, excuse me, to raise the question, but also to have a better local knowledge of the situation in the various countries. So the purpose of this project is to characterize and to quantify, to analyze and to monitor and inform on the pattern and the development of the floodplains, and we will and the effects of floodplains on the ecosystem at the global scale. So we'll use the data at the global scale, different items, topography, agricultural biodiversity, and or we'll produce new data, original data from the database. We'll create and we will include satellite images data as well as the data from the web. And in order to get to the global scale, we will not produce a full map that will represent the urban planning growth everywhere, but we want to work with stratas, and therefore we can select for a city or an agglomeration in order to go from we'll have 50 sites which represent the various cases, and then will lead us to, from 1980 to today. So we'll look at some emblematic examples that we want to and we will have a finer analysis, for total impact. So the zone of interest that where we did our study site, where we look at the city, but of course we will do a comparison upstream, downstream of the impact of the city on the rivers and on the floodplains, and the time slot will be 40 years. Simply because this is the window which shows the intensification of the urban growth at the global level. And therefore, the first results we've obtained was that we wanted to characterize the municipality or the agglomerations which are in floodplains, and therefore from general data, climatic, topographic, and demographic statistics and urban size, we were selected the first 300 sites, which are we organize them as sets of cities. For example, on screen you can see the cluster 5, cluster 10, which are different in terms of population growth, the size of the city, and the demographic dynamics in the last 50 years. This was the basis so that we can characterize the 300 cities, and then we were able to understand what are the impact of urban growth, and therefore we could put forward the fact that there is a diversity of cases, which it was not obvious initially. On the screen you can see the city of Lhasa on the Tibet plateau, where population growth was lesser. It lost only 150,000, 15,000 inhabitants in 150,000 inhabitants. Sorry, and we've seen. You see the strata, which shows the occurrence of floods of the water in the last 50 years, and versus everything that is green is after 2000. There is more water than there was before 2000, and this is they built dams and channels along the Lhasa River to ensure water supply. Is there another example? It's the New Delhi and the Yamuna River. Here, population growth was just dramatic. Plus 26.7 million inhabitants. Versus the 70s, and this transformation can be seen on the images on the left. You see the spread, urban sprawl between 89 and 2018. But this comprised not only the city itself, but even downstream. You see the two graphics on the right-hand side, the 2 years, 89 and 2018, where clearly there's been a change in the rivers landscape with less secondary branches and less floodplains versus what existed in 89. And last example I wanted to show you, Denver and the South Platte River. I see the population growth was more modest, plus 1.7 million inhabitants versus the 70s. But again, the impact is felt downstream from the city, especially in the plain. We see with the advent of the green zones, more and more water which appeared after the 2000. For example, this is progressive. We see it on the map, map and graphs on the left-hand side. And this is associated with the extraction of sediment in the floodplains, which then they fill up with water, because they're sort of, they're basically raising the underground water table because they're exploiting the residues or so the next step will make it possible, thanks to the bourgeois, to see if there are some sort of general pattern at the global scale in terms of evolution of surfaces, and explain what are the drivers, and then we'll look more in details through images, satellite images, to see what is the evolution of the patterns. And then, thanks to the work of our colleagues from the teledetection in Montpellier and the thesis of our PhD student, we will be able to characterize the evolution of land use and to better detect changes in zones dedicated to imaging. And of course, there is a thesis of Juscelin Myria, the PhD of Juscelin Myria and Bajemont, to explore the effect of urban growth and changes in floodplains on biodiversity and the functioning of ecosystems, and also the interaction between city and rivers via modeling, because via the data analysis from the web. And to conclude, well, we will try to quantify, see how this has an influence on the socio-ecosystemic functions, which, especially in the case of cities, through floodplains, and we are discussing the indicators to be mobilized from data and the information we will produce. Of course, trying to take into account the local variability which can be associated with such functions and their management in the various parts of the. So I went a bit fast. I'm very sorry, but I hope I will have time for questions. Thank you for your attention, and do not hesitate to come and see our website to be informed about our progress. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Barbara, pour cette présentation.
Thank you, Barbara, for your presentation of this globe project for the urban and growth in floodplains. This fits within in line with the three first presentations. So we got a bit of time for questions. I can see there is a question from Gérard Payen. So, do we target the floodplains and the alluvial plains? So, these are two different concepts: alluvial plain and floodplains. We deal with alluvial plains, but with the most recent dynamics of the last 40 years and a bit further. But it's not just alluvial. It's not just floodplains. It's also alluvial plains. Sorry. Thank you. Do we have other questions to Barbara? So, concerning the urban growth process, you said that there was a lot of transformation taking place. So, what surprised you most? Which are the most spectacular transformation you've witnessed, observed? Well, each time we find new cases, we're always surprised. Possibly, what I did not quite realize sometimes was the link between water resources and the sediment resource. And there are amazing extraction of sediments everywhere in the world, which of course will then, establish a link between the river dynamics. So we bear, basically we raise to the surface the underground water table. We change the river landscape at the level of the river and the plain. So this is something that we did not realize initially. We didn't realize how much what it was, and the fact that it is spread all over. We find it all over the world. Other questions for Barbara? Any question to Barbara? Is there a geography or zone where you can see diverse continents? I mean, are there situations that emerge, or is it too early? I think it's a bit early. I think it's a bit early still. But what we did realize was that there is an increase of water zones. We thought they would shrink, but in fact not. In fact, we see more and more water zones. So more water surface than we expected, actually. Okay, since we have no other questions, we'll move on to the general debate. For the first.
Other comments? So Victoria has come back and Gérard has put his camera back on. So there was a question about legal personhood. In the scientific community, this question is being discussed a lot. And earlier on, Gérard Payen brought it up. And I said to myself, listening to both of you, in fact, that it's a huge project. When we think about governance, there's still an awful lot to be done, especially when we compare that with what's happening in France or at European level. There are also these legal aspects. There are many things at stake. So what about this emergence of awareness about protection dynamics at a global level? Shouldn't we push for both, really? So to answer that question, concerning the Latin American continent, recognizing rivers as legal entities has an indirect impact, recognizing the rights of indigenous peoples who are not very well recognized. So it's a strategy that's used so that the rights of these indigenous peoples, so that they can continue with their traditional life, etc., are respected and recognized above all. So it's very much linked to the rights of indigenous peoples. And that's the case in New Zealand as well, which is what Gérard was mentioning. Absolutely. Gérard, would you like to say something? Yes, perhaps I'll explain why. I talked about that straight away. It's a subject that is making a lot of people cross. And in my opinion, there's a symbolic value that's very interesting. People are beginning to think about rivers. They're not just rubbish tips. And I think that legally, it's not a good thing. It's a useless complication. Giving them a legal entity doesn't mean anything at all in itself. You have to define what the river's rights are. What about the damage? You have to characterize that so that there can be some form of recourse. And then who is going to represent the river? Lots of people can represent a river. They have different interests, these people. So the legal personhood of a river, that means building the environmental law that applies to the river, because you have to apply that law. So why not have a better environmental law and apply that? And that's what I wanted to say earlier on. So it doesn't simplify anything having a legal entity as a river. It just creates an obstacle. For the river itself, the first thing to be done is to apply the law on the environment. Thank you very much. Perhaps a question for Jeff and Barbara. So can you read the question, Barbara? It's a general question about the relevance of maps. Yes, I'll give my answer and then I'll let Jeff chip in. So I agree about that question. In fact, there are two answers. There's the fact that it's not given. That's already a piece of information. Why? Why? That's the first question. But if we talk about the Glow Up project, we're not trying to fill a map. And there's an awful lot of work that we've been doing over the past year to try and understand and interpret the data to find out whether that data is complete and how reliable it is. And even if we will never have a complete picture, it is nevertheless important for us to report on the large variability of cases that can be observed, because that will help with our global vision of what's possible, and that will allow us to understand what's happening at local level too. Whereabouts we are from a global point of view is important, therefore. Yes?
Jeff, do you have the question? Was it translated for you?
No, it's something about maps and gaps.
I can translate it if you want.
Yeah.
It's about how do we interpret global maps which have a lack of data in certain regions of the world.
Yeah, I think that, of course, you have to be careful with that. But I also think that as long as you're clear and upfront with the limitations of what you're doing, there's still value in mapping what can be mapped at those scales. And the increase in the availability and the resolution of satellite remote imagery is pretty amazing, along with a number of other types of sensors and our ability to integrate all these sensors. It does seem like we're moving in the right direction in terms of filling in those gaps.
Mm-hmm. Est-ce que cette mise en visibilité
And this visibility, this light that we're shining on things, is that not going to feed the debates when it comes to global governance, for example, and when it comes to international law, focusing on rivers? So if we shed a light on the transformations, on the threats, is that not going to allow us to change law? Yes, yes, absolutely. Yes, that can certainly have a positive effect, on law. At least it will raise awareness. So I agree with that. And what about threats, Gérard? you know, with respect to major conferences? What about challenges relating to dams and energy issues and the impacts on aquatic ecosystems? Because that, again, is a subject that is very visible at global level, isn't it? You know, there are maps that exist. We've started to measure the effects. Jeff mentioned this earlier on. So is this something that's coming into public debate? Well, listen, I don't know what the UN is discussing with respect to the environment in detail. Maybe they're talking about these things over there. I don't know. What I do know, and it's not going to satisfy what I have to say. So these questions concern all water aspects, not just rivers in the future, but pollution, resources, all of those questions. Everything is linked. Now, states up until now haven't managed to have a forum where they talk about all of these water-related questions. That's what the big problem is when it comes to global governance. You know, the French Water Partnership was in New York. It was the first time that there was an event like this where everybody was talking about water, and that was the main message, wasn't it? You know, states, you have to talk about water. That was the message. But there was a second message during that conference, and that was to say that it's not enough. It's not enough just coming together and talking about it, because of the global goals for water will never be reached if only the water community is contributing. So to achieve the water objectives, farmers also need to voluntarily contribute. Urban planners need to voluntarily contribute. Those in charge of economic development, they need to be careful. They also need to contribute. So the second message that we took to the United Nations was to say, when you're organizing a big conference on agriculture or on energy or on whatever the topic, basically, please focus part of that conference on water, because there is bound to be an impact on water. So up until now, it's never happened. So when you talk about a dam, you talk about water. But the problem with a dam is that it's a multi-purpose tool, as they say in English. So it has different objectives. And in dams, you've got environmental, energy, irrigation problems. So to talk seriously about this at global level, there has to be a forum, there has to be a place where all subjects can be covered. We're not there yet. The only message of hope, and it's important, I think we did trigger something last year, because we talked about water and you know, all of these different aspects in the future, but there's still a lot to be built. Thank you very much for that last piece of information, that last contribution. I think that can open the debate. I'd like to thank our different speakers. Sarah, I think we've come to the end of our webinar. So I'd like to thank our translators, because we had simultaneous translation in English and in French. I'd also like to thank Sarah, who was in charge of the organization of the webinar, and it was done very well. So we kind of set the scene when it comes to certain problems that are becoming more visible. We talked about solutions and collective strategies based on law or based on governance, things that will help us address these subjects better. We've understood that there are major changes. We've referred to the water crisis. This was referred to during the UN New York conference. Gérard Payen mentioned that. So there are lots of projects. So changes to governance is one. The involvement of stakeholders, the holistic approach that is necessary. You know, solutions to different water conflicts as well. Lots of international water courses are subject to conflicts. So we need to characterize, assess, understand. And this is what's being done by cities and that's backing up the first efforts focused on dams. We're seeing the effects of climate change on the water resource, low water levels, floods. This is what we heard from Jeff. We need to continue to talk about these things and to really shine a light on them. And I think that scientists have a role to play here. They need to show what's happening, but they also need to trigger the debates and contribute to prevention if that's possible. We had the case of the Pantanal. Matthias Wenzen mentioned it. We know that the challenges are huge when it comes from the Balkans, for the Amazon as well, and elsewhere in the world. Anyway, thank you to everybody. Thank you to the speakers, and see you soon.